I wasn't in a good place that fall, and that is a plain sentence for a season that felt like carrying wet cement in my chest. I was 48, running a county road grader on District 6 routes, the kind of work where your eyes stay 20 feet ahead, and your hands do what they've done for 20 years, while your mind drifts toward places you don't want it to go. Leah had been gone 14 months. Liver failure, quick at the end and cruel in the middle. My boy Cody, grown and living 2 counties over, had stopped returning calls around month 9, right when folks started saying I looked better because I'd finally gone dry. Better is a strange word when the house stays quiet enough to hear your own breathing in the hallway. I had 73 sober days when I turned off the state road and headed down to my daddy's old hunting parcel by the cold river. And I remember that number because I counted everything then. Days sober, dollars in checking, pills left in the bottle for blood pressure, hours of sleep, minutes between thoughts of Leah that hit hard enough to make me pull over. The parcel sat on 22 acres of mixed alder and fir with a one-room cabin that leaned slightly toward the river, like it was listening. Daddy used it for deer season and for hiding from everybody when hiding still looked like fishing. After he died, I paid taxes late and let the place run down because grief likes neglect. That spring I'd borrowed against my truck to catch up on a hospital balance and 2 old credit cards, and by September I was staring at numbers that did not care about my feelings. Sell the parcel, clear debt, keep moving. That was the plan I repeated to myself on the drive in, same way I read out a checklist before bringing the grader blade down. Inspect hydraulics, test lights, don't overthink. I'd gotten good at making life small enough to manage. Task list, meal, sleep, repeat. Anything bigger than that felt like standing at the edge of deep water after dark. The gate chain had rusted to the point of stubbornness, and when I got it loose I could smell rain coming up the valley, that cold mineral smell that lifts off river stones before a storm. Fence posts along the south line had slumped where spring runoff undercut them, so I did what I always did when I didn't want to feel much. I worked. I pulled 3 posts, tamped in 2 replacements, stretched woven wire with a come-along that had seen better decades, and cursed under my breath when the staple bucket tipped in the mud. My hands knew that rhythm, gloves slick with damp, boots planted shoulder into the pull. Practical labor was the one language that still made sense. Tuck watched from the shade, old yellow mutt gone grey around the eyes, one ear folded forever from a barbed wire scrape, back when he still chased everything that moved. He'd come to me and Leah from the county shelter 10 years earlier and had aged into a companion who believed deeply in naps and forgiveness. Every now and then he'd thump his tail against the porch step, keeping time with my hammer. By late afternoon, the drizzle settled into a steady curtain, and I sat under the cabin porch with canned beef stew, warming over a camp stove because the propane line inside had a leak I didn't trust. Rain ticked off the tin roof, then ran through a hole over the left corner and dripped beside my boot in a perfect 4-second rhythm. I ate straight from the pot, elbow on my knee, looking out at a yard that had once held Leah laughing at me for splitting kindling too big for the stove. She used to say I treated all wood like I was trying to win a contest nobody announced. I'd answer with some dumb line about structural integrity, and she'd roll her eyes in that fond way that used to reset my whole nervous system. Under that porch, with rain and lukewarm stew and no one across from me, I could feel how much of my life had become maintenance instead of living. When the stew was gone and the light started thinning, I took out my phone and opened the voice memo app because calling Cody cold usually went to voicemail, and hearing that tone one more time felt heavier than I had in me. I drafted what I might say instead, speaking low so it felt less official. "Hey, bud, it's Dad. I'm out at Grandpa's place, just checking in. No emergency. You don't have to call back right away. I stopped, deleted it, and started again. Cody, I know I wasn't easy there for a while. I know you got tired of promises. I'm trying to do this right now. Delete. Rain on tin. Tuck breathing beside my leg. Third try. I got to 15 seconds, then quit again because the words sounded rehearsed, and he deserved better than rehearsed. I set the phone face down and listened to water moving through the ditch at the edge of the yard. My father used to say, if you can't say it honest, wait until you can. I did not know if that was wisdom or avoidance. In my family, those two often dressed alike. The next morning broke mild, low clouds, and a soft brightness that made every wet branch look polished. I checked the truck toolboxes, tightened the porch gutter brackets I'd ignored too long, and wrote a sell or keep list on the back of an old feed receipt. Keep, family history, hunting rights, quiet. Sell, debt, distance, no time, too much upkeep. The lists looked equally convincing, which irritated me more than if one had clearly won. By the second day of that trip, I understood I hadn't come only to decide about land. I'd come because at home every room had Lear-shaped empty in it, and I wanted a place where the empty had trees around it and a job attached. Around 4 that afternoon, I clipped Tuck's lead onto his collar out of habit, then took it off again because he moved slow now, and stayed close. We walked the old logging spur behind the parcel, a 2-track that wound toward the braided flats of the cold river maze. Folks called it that because the river split and rejoined itself over and over through willow islands, cobble bars and side channels that shifted each season. In spring thaw or autumn rain, familiar bends could mimic each other enough to turn a confident man around. I grew up in those woods and still treated the name like it was mostly for tourists. But even then, I knew the place could humble anybody who got careless. Mist lifted in strips from the water, and the ground under Alder went slick where leaves had started to fall. Tuck trotted 10 feet ahead, stopping now and then to look back and make sure I was still coming, as if I might evaporate if he didn't verify me. I talked to him more than to most people that year. "You're no help with financial planning," I said when he sniffed a stump and ignored me. "You vote keep, I can tell." His tail made one slow sweep. There was a dry humour in being a middle-aged man arguing property strategy with a dog who once ate a whole bar of soap and then looked offended about consequences. That kind of moment didn't fix anything, but it put a little air in the room inside my chest. As we dropped toward the lower spur, something in the woods settled. Not dramatic, just noticeable if you'd spent enough hours outdoors to know the baseline. Chickadees had been fussing upstream. Then they weren't. The creeklet to our left still ran. Leaves still moved, but the usual layered chatter thinned out until our footfalls on damp gravel sounded oddly precise. Tuck stopped near the tree line and sat. He didn't bristle, didn't growl, didn't press against my leg the way he did around coyotes. He just sat calm, head tilted slightly, watching into the alder shadows like he was waiting for somebody to finish what they were doing. I stood there longer than I needed to, telling myself there were a dozen normal explanations. Wind change, hawk overhead, my nerves writing stories where there weren't any. Still, I felt observed in a way that wasn't sharp or hostile, more like being noticed. We turned back before dusk because I hadn't brought a headlamp, and I wasn't interested in proving anything to myself. On the walk home, I kept one hand on the faded strap of my tool bag and watched the ground the way I did on county shifts after the first freeze, scanning for small hazards before they became expensive ones. The path held only mud, old hoofprints, and the shine of recent rain. At the porch, I toweled Tuck off, fed him half a can of chicken and rice, and stood a while with my hand on his neck while he ate. Warm dog, cool air, the smell of wet cedar from the stacked rounds by the shed. Ordinary things. I slept badly anyway. That night, I dreamed I was in the grader cab with Leah in the passenger seat, which never happened in real life because policy and common sense both said no. But dreams do not care much about procedure. She wasn't sick in the dream. She was looking out the windshield at a road washed out by spring runoff and saying, "Wayne, you keep trying to blade over the same rut." I woke before daylight with my jaw clenched and my t-shirt damp at the collar, and for a long minute I sat on the edge of that narrow cabin bed and let the ache move through instead of wrestling it. There was a time I would have reached for a bottle before my feet hit the floor. That morning, I reached for coffee grounds and a clean mug. Progress can look small from the outside. I stepped onto the porch with the first cup and watched mist drag low over the yard, silver in the early light. The fence I'd fixed held straight. The gate stood latched. Tuck came out, stretched, and leaned lightly against my shin. Not needy, just present. I looked toward the spur where we'd walked and felt that same pull again, a mix of dread and curiosity I couldn't have explained if pressed. I'd come to sell a property and settle accounts. That was still true. But standing there with damp boards under my boots and river air in my lungs, I knew another account had come due, one with no bank name on it. I had spent more than a year trying to pack away every memory before dark, and the boxes were splitting anyway. The woods didn't ask me to explain that. They just held still long enough for me to hear it. I stood there until the coffee cooled in my hand, watching fog lift off the low ground in strips so thin they looked like breath on glass. The cabin roof ticked as it dried. Somewhere out by the ditch, water moved over stones with that low, steady sound that can either settle you or make you feel more alone, depending on what kind of morning you're carrying. I set the mug on the porch rail, rubbed Tuck between the shoulders, and told him, "Come on, partner, let's go see what still needs fixing." He blinked up at me like he already knew there wasn't a fence post in the world that was going to solve what was wrong with me. We took the upper side of the parcel first, where the ground rose toward fir and the understory opened enough to walk without wrestling brush every 10 feet. I carried loppers, a folding saw, and a coil of orange survey tape I'd found in Daddy's old workbench drawer. The practical plan was simple. Clear the washed footpath, check the culvert crossing, get eyes on the old deer stand, head back before noon. The private plan, which I didn't say out loud because saying it made it feel flimsy, was to stay moving hard enough that I didn't have to think about Leah's last week in the hospital or the silence after my son's name on a phone screen. Work helped for a while. I cut 2 alder limbs that had dropped over the path, kicked loose slate off a slope where runoff had started a narrow slide, and reset 1 tilted trail marker post with a flat rock wedge. Tuck wandered within sight, stopping often, not from nerves but from age. He favoured his left hip now when he climbed. Every time he paused, he'd look back to check me, and every time I caught him doing it, something in my chest gave a little. He was a dog, not a sermon, but he was constant in a season where constant had gotten rare. By late morning, the cloud deck thinned, and a weak stripe of sun reached through the trees and laid across the old logging spur like a path, painted in pale brass. I took my jacket off, tied it around my waist, and sat on a stump above the cut bank where you could hear the main channel of the cold river but not quite see it through willow and alder. This was where Daddy used to smoke in secret after telling Mom he'd quit, staring at the water like it might forgive him for things he never said plain. I understood him better than I wanted to. I pulled my phone out, opened Cody's contact, and watched my thumb hover over the call button. The same argument started up in my head, familiar as an old ache. Don't call if you can't be clear. Don't wait so long that silence becomes the only language left. You hurt him. Own it. You're trying now. Say that too. I told myself this couldn't be the hardest thing I'd ever done, pressing one button and speaking honest for 30 seconds. But grief and guilt are not measured tasks. They don't care about logic. I locked the phone and put it back in my pocket without dialing, then sat there feeling both relieved and ashamed, which is a rotten combination. When we headed downslope towards the braided flats, the day stayed mild, almost pleasant, but my mood had that frayed edge I'd come to recognize in sobriety. Back when I drank, I could numb these stretches and call it coping. Sober, I felt each hour as itself. No padding, no blur, no shortcut around afternoons when memory lined up in your head and took turns knocking. Tuck trotted ahead, then circled back and bumped his shoulder into my knee once, like he'd done since he was young whenever I stood still too long. "I'm coming," I said. "You don't have to supervise." His tail answered once, slow and sure. The lower spur narrowed where spring floods had bitten into the bank, and beyond that, the ground opened toward the first of the side channels that made folks call this place the Maze. The cold river didn't move like one river here. It split, curved, doubled back, braided around cobble bars, then slipped together again out of sight. In high water, it rewrote itself overnight. I'd seen men with better maps than mine get turned around because one familiar bend looked too much like another when mist came up. I knew all that. I still walked with the confidence of somebody raised here, which was part knowledge and part stubbornness, and not always easy to separate. Around noon, the woods went quiet in a way that made me stop mid-step. Not silent exactly. Water still talked over rock. A branch creaked somewhere upslope, but the bird chatter dropped out all at once, as if somebody had turned a dial. No jays complaining, no chickadees fussing, no flicker-tapping dead wood. The absence had shape. Tuck moved 10 feet ahead of me, then sat. Same as yesterday, but this time he sat square, ears forward, body loose, looking toward a stand of alder at the edge of the mudflat. No hackles, no growl, no lean into me for reassurance. Just calm attention. I waited for him to break posture and sniff around like normal. He didn't. I listened harder, felt that old field instinct from road work kick in, the one that notices what changed before you know why it matters. Wind was light and steady from the west. No sharp animal smell. No fresh tracks I could see from where I stood. I had the odd, steady sensation of being watched by something that wasn't trying to crowd me. That sentence sounds foolish even now, but it's the most accurate one I have. I wasn't scared. I was alert, yes, but not afraid. There was a difference, and I felt it in my shoulders easing instead of tightening. "Okay," I said softly, mostly to hear a human voice. "If you're waiting on permission, you can stop." Tuck glanced back at me, then returned his focus to the alder fringe. I took 3 slow steps forward, boots sinking at the edge of the flat where yesterday's rain had left a skin of slick mud. That was when I saw the stones. They ran in a neat line from the mouth of a shallow gully toward the higher path, each one smooth and river-worn, fist-sized to palm-sized, set at even spacing like careful punctuation. 8 stones total, pale grey against dark mud. Impossible to miss once your eyes found the pattern. What mattered was placement. Not random scatter from runoff, not a pile kicked up by tires, but a deliberate run angled around the softest patch where a boot could sink to the ankle if you stepped wrong. I knew this ground. Last evening there had been only churned mud and hoof marks from a deer. No stones. I crouched and touched the nearest one. Cool, damp, freshly set. Mud lipped around the base in a clean ring where weight had pressed down after the rain, not before. I checked the gully edge. No slide marks, no wash line, no channel that could have rolled them into shape by accident. I stood up slowly and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. Tuck stayed seated, tail resting still on the ground, eyes fixed in that same patient direction. Then, as if some quiet agreement had been reached, he rose, walked to the third stone, and waited there for me like that was exactly where he expected us to go. I would like to tell you I handled that moment with scientific detachment and crisp reasoning. Truth is, I stood there with my mouth half open, feeling ridiculous and strangely seen at the same time. I actually said, "Well, thank you, I guess," to no one I could identify, which was not on my list of behaviors for a sober, middle-aged county employee trying to keep his life respectable. Tuck gave me one look that could have meant anything, and then stepped to the next stone. I followed, because whatever had arranged that line knew the terrain better than my pride did. Each marker led cleanly around the worst of the mud and up to firmer ground where the old spur reappeared under leaf litter. When I reached the last stone, I turned back to study the line from above. From that angle, it wasn't just practical. It was precise, almost like somebody had stood where I now stood and thought through how a tired man and an old dog would move safest from point A to point B. That thought landed heavier than it should have. I stayed there long enough for drizzle to start again, fine and cold, then tucked my chin into my collar and headed uphill with Tuck close to my leg. All the way back to the cabin, my mind ran through explanations in plain order because that's what I do when facts get slippery. Kids from town pulling a prank. Maybe, except no boot prints smaller than mine and no fresh tire tracks at the gate. A hunter marking a crossing. Possible, but hunters in this county use flagging tape or broken twigs, not tidy riverstone geometry in a mudflat that washes often. My memory wrong. I considered that one longest because it was convenient and humbling at once, but the tactile details wouldn't release me. I had touched those stones. I had seen the clean press of each base in new mud. This wasn't recollection drift. At the porch, I toweled Tuck dry and set his bowl down. He ate, then came over and laid his head on my knee while I sat on the step with rain ticking the roof again. I kept looking toward the spur through the curtain of weather, half expecting to see somebody step out and claim a harmless joke. Nobody did. The yard held still. The fence line held straight. The world looked ordinary right up until it didn't, and then ordinary again. I rested my hand on the back of Tuck's neck and said, quiet enough that only he could hear, whatever that was, it wasn't trying to scare us. He sighed, old and content, like he had already decided that hours ago. He sighed, old and content, like he had already decided that hours ago. I stayed on that porch step until the rain thinned to a mist and the light went from grey to that flat blue you get right before evening folds in. The strange part wasn't the stones anymore. The strange part was how quickly my mind kept returning to them, not with panic, not with dread, but with a kind of practical curiosity that had been missing from me for months. Grief had narrowed my days to survival tasks. Those 8 stones cracked that routine open by half an inch. I could still feel the cool surface of the first one under my fingertips, the clean way it had been set into mud. I reheated coffee I didn't need, checked the door latch twice, and laid out dry socks for morning like I was prepping for a work shift. Tuck followed me room to room, then settled by the stove with a grunt. Before bed, I opened Cody's contact again, stared at his name until the screen dimmed, and set the phone face down without calling. For the first night in a long while, I fell asleep thinking about something besides what I'd lost. At first light, I walked straight back to the lower spur with Tuck at my knee and a steady rain tapping my jacket hood. The cold river maze had risen overnight, and water moved faster through the side channel, brown at the edges and silver in the centre. I expected the stone line to be scattered. That would have restored order in a way. Rain plus runoff plus mud equals no tidy pattern. But when we reached the gully mouth, there they were again. Not the same exact placement as yesterday, but the same intent made visible. A new line of smooth stones, pale against dark ground, curving wider now to avoid a fresh sink near the bank. 10 stones this time, evenly spaced with the same thoughtful intervals, as if whoever set them had measured with stride length and old dog pace in mind. I crouched and studied each one, letting my road crew habits take over. I checked for tool marks, looked for drag lines, tracked runoff direction, even stood back and traced the slope with my eyes like I was diagnosing washboard damage on a county shoulder. Nothing about it read accidental. Whoever had done it had worked after the hardest rain, in low light or steady weather, and done it without leaving obvious prints in conditions that should have held at least one. Tuck stepped to the 4th stone and looked back, waiting again with that patient expression he got when I overcomplicated simple things. "You're enjoying this," I told him. "You finally found a trail system made by someone as stubborn as me." He sneezed, shook rain off his muzzle, and moved to the next marker. I followed the line to high ground and found another sign where last week's washout had chewed a narrow trench across the path. 2 alder sticks had been laid in a clean X on the unstable side, not in the centre where a hunter might flag a route, but directly over the soft edge where a boot could shear through and twist an ankle. On the firm side, 3 short branch pieces pointed uphill like blunt arrows. I stood there in drizzle, hands on my hips, feeling equal parts skeptical and grateful. If this was a prank, it was a highly competent one with no audience and excellent hazard awareness. My mind ran its usual defense pattern. Kids from town, they'd leave chatter, wrappers, tire tracks, some evidence they wanted to be known. Hunter sign? Maybe, except most hunters I knew preferred minimal fuss and familiar markers, and none used crossed sticks with this kind of practical precision. My own doing? Forgotten? Not likely. I tied flagging tape bright enough to guide helicopters. I did not make subtle woodland diagrams with river stones and alder twigs. The explanations kept collapsing under touch and placement. I stood in that wet corridor with Tuck's shoulder against my leg and thought, plain and direct, this can't be real. And right behind it came a second thought that settled deeper. Whatever it isn't trying to scare me. By the 3rd morning after I found the first stones, my routine had shifted without permission. Coffee, feed Tuck, check weather, then walk the spur to see what had changed. Grief did not leave. It simply loosened enough to make room for observation. I noticed the smell of split cedar when air dried after rain. I tracked where fog held in low pockets and where it lifted first along the fir line. And whenever a marker appeared, Tuck greeted it with the same calm trust he gave old neighbours at a fence line. He never barked. He never tucked tail. He treated each sign like part of a conversation already underway. That afternoon, I found the woodpile altered. I had split a rough stack of fir rounds the day before and left the pile open under a sagging tarp because I planned to restack when it dried. Beside it now sat a tight column of cedar kindling, each stick wrist thick or smaller, bark mostly dry, ends snapped clean, laid in alternating courses so air could move through. It was better stacked than my own, not decorative, not mysterious, just efficient. Exactly what you'd do if you wanted someone to get a stubborn stove lit on a wet evening. I looked around for boot impressions and saw only old deer tracks and my own ruts from hauling rounds. I laughed once, short and disbelieving. Great, I said to no one in particular. Now I'm being outperformed at basic chores by a ghost with good planning skills. Tuck, who had no respect for existential crises, walked over and sniffed the cedar stack, then sat beside it like he was guarding a delivery. I reached down and lifted one piece. Dry core, faint, sweet smell, cut from standing deadwood and carried in by hand. No rot, no punk, useful wood. The kind of help a person leaves when they notice another person is tired. Inside the cabin, while water heated for stew, I stood at the sink and watched rain bead along the window frame and let the truth of my own reactions settle. I was not unraveling. I was not inventing this to soothe loneliness. The signs were physical and repeated. I could point to them, touch them, test them. Yet the bigger shift was emotional. For the first time since Leah died, curiosity had outrun sorrow for more than a minute. I still missed her with that same bone-deep ache, but alongside it sat a steady question that pulled me forward. Who sees me out here, and why this kind of care? I had spent a year assuming the world was indifferent, maybe efficient if you were lucky, but never kind without a price. That assumption was starting to crack. I pulled my folded sell versus keep list from under the salt tin and ran the numbers again in my head. Sale money could wipe the truck note and buy breathing room, but keeping the place meant carrying taxes I was already late worrying about. Debt made one answer look obvious. Standing in that kitchen, I could not make it feel final. Toward dusk, the rain finally broke. A low sun slid under cloud and threw amber light across the gravel bars. Tuck grew restless by the door, pacing once, then returning to stare at me. I clipped his lead on, then took it off again out of habit and trust. Short loop, I told him. Lower bar and back before dark. We headed down the spur with the wet earth smell rising around us, alder leaves sticking to my boots, river noise fuller than yesterday. The woods carried that same hush I had felt before each marker appeared, but this time it felt less like warning and more like attention. When we reached the gravel bar, the maze opened wide in front of us, braided channels glinting between willow islands and polished cobble. Evening light caught the mist and turned it gold at the edges. A kingfisher cut low over water, then vanished behind brush. Tuck stopped near the bank, tail level, ears forward, posture easy. He looked across to the far side, then back at me once, as if to confirm I was seeing what he was seeing. I followed his line of sight, and at first caught only shadow among alder trunks. Then the shadow moved. It stepped into a gap where the light held, and scale hit me all at once. The figure stood on the opposite bar, maybe 80 yards out, dark against pale stones, shoulders broad enough to make nearby saplings look like switchgrass. 8 feet at least, maybe 9, based on the alder line behind it. My breath stalled, then returned in a shallow pull. I did not feel hunted. I did not feel cornered. I felt the way you feel when a belief you built your life around suddenly proves too small. The figure moved again, and what settled me was not size, but behavior. It crossed the bar with deliberate care, placing each foot between young willows rather than through them, angling around a downed branch instead of snapping it. One massive arm reached out once to steady against a trunk, fingers long and dark in the low light. And even from that distance the motion looked controlled, almost gentle. It stopped with its body partly turned toward me and held still. No chest beating, no charge, no show. Just stillness, presence. I stood rooted, one hand resting lightly on Tuck's back. He sat down beside my boot and watched in quiet focus, then looked up at me as if waiting for my decision. The river moved between us, steady and cold, and evening mist slid through the gap in soft bands. I could make out the head shape, the slope of shoulder, the thick, dark coat catching bronze where the sun reached it. The face remained mostly shadowed, but I felt, clearly, unexpectedly, that I was being regarded. Not assessed as threat or prey, simply noticed the way I had noticed it. Two living things holding a line of attention across running water. I heard myself say, low and awkward, "Evening." It was the same tone I used with neighbours at mailboxes, and that almost made me laugh from sheer disbelief. The figure did not answer, of course. It shifted weight once, slow, then stepped back a pace and paused. The movement had none of the abruptness of flight and none of the pressure of approach. It was a respectful retreat, like someone giving room when they see you need it. Then it turned toward the trees, bent slightly to pass beneath a leaning alder limb, and disappeared into the timber with hardly any sound beyond one soft rustle of leaves. I stayed there long enough for the last light to drain off the gravel and the channel to turn from silver to slate. My legs felt weak in that aftershock way that comes when adrenaline never fully spikes, but still passes through. I knelt, put both hands on Tuck's ribs, and felt his breathing steady and warm. "You saw him too," I whispered. "I'm not inventing this." Tuck licked my wrist once, then stood and nudged my knee with his nose, practical as ever. It was getting dark, and old dogs do not indulge long metaphysical pauses. On the walk back to the cabin, every familiar landmark looked freshly outlined. Not strange, just more particular. The split snag by the fork, the bend where clay slicked over stones, the cedar stump with 3 nail heads from a stand long gone. I kept replaying the crossing on the bar, the careful foot placements, the unhurried pause. I had expected fear if I ever saw something that large and unknown. What I felt instead was a deep, steady wonder threaded with relief, so sharp it almost hurt. Something out there knew I was moving through this place and had chosen, repeatedly, to make the way safer. At the porch, I dried Tuck, lit the stove with one of the cedar sticks from that neatly stacked pile, and watched flame catch fast and clean. I set my wet boots by the door and sat with my palms open to the heat, listening to rain start again on the roof in a light, even rhythm. In the firebox glow, the day arranged itself into facts I could live with. I had seen a figure too large to explain by ordinary means. I had seen it move with care. I had been left markers that kept me and my dog on solid ground. I did not have a framework that solved all of that, but for once I did not need one before morning. I only needed honesty, so I spoke into the quiet cabin, to the stove, to Tuck, to whoever might still be listening beyond the dark trees. "Thank you for the path." The words left my mouth and settled into the stovelight like they belonged there, simple and a little awkward, and I sat for a long time afterward with my hands out to the heat, while rain tapped the tin roof in a steady pattern that matched Tuck's breathing. I kept waiting for the sensible part of me to reassert itself, to flatten the evening into misidentification and tired eyes, but it did not arrive on schedule. I had spent years trusting what could be measured, graded, repaired, and signed off. Out by the gravel bar, I had just seen something that did not fit any report form I'd ever filled out, and the most unsettling piece was not the size or the silence. It was the restraint. Whatever stood across that channel had room to do almost anything and chose courtesy instead. I slept in starts, woke before dawn, and lit the stove with another piece of that dry cedar stack. By the time first light reached the porch rail, I had made a list on a legal pad because lists still helped me keep my footing. Propane hose, dog food, chain oil, phone card, call bank, about payment date. At the bottom, in smaller print, I wrote, "Ask somebody local, carefully." I almost scratched that line out, then left it. Pride had gotten me turned around in easier places than this. The drive to Miller's Fuel and Grocery took 40 minutes on wet county roads, windshield wipers working hard, River running high off to my right, through breaks in Alder. I had known Earl Miller my whole life in that small town way where you never had dinner together, but you can recognize each other's trucks from half a mile. He stood behind the register in a quilted vest, reading glasses low on his nose, and looked up when I came in, carrying 2 empty propane cylinders and a bag of return cans. "Wayne Jennings," he said. "Thought you moved into that grader and gave up civilization." "Civilization has coffee filters," I said. "I'm not that tough." He snorted once and rang up my items while I added kibble and chain oil to the counter. We did the normal talk first, weather and culvert washouts and whose hayfield had taken on water. Then he paused with the receipt halfway torn and looked at me over those glasses. "You look better than last spring," he said, not prying, just factual. "I'm trying," I said. 70-some days dry. He nodded like a man receiving useful information and filing it with care. "Good, keep doing that." I should have paid and left. Instead, I heard myself say, "Earl, can I ask you something without you deciding I've gone soft in the head?" He folded the receipt and set it on the counter, giving me his full attention in a way that made the question feel less foolish. Depends how soft. "I saw something on the South Bar last night. Big, dark, moving careful. Too big for a bear, wrong shape anyway. It watched me, then stepped off and left. And for 3 days, somebody's been laying river stones where the spur gets unsafe, marking the good route." I kept my voice low. "I know how that sounds." He rested both palms on the worn wood and took a breath through his nose. No laugh, no theatre, no quick legend-telling. "My granddad used to say there are things out there that mind their own business better than people do," he said. "If what you saw is what I think you're saying, the main rule is simple. Don't chase, don't crowd, don't brag around men who only want trophies and stories. I haven't told anybody but you." "Good." He slid the receipt toward me. "And if stones are being set to keep you off bad ground, I'd pay attention." The line landed straight in me because it matched what I already knew and was still resisting. We stood in silence a second, the cooler compressor buzzing behind him, rain ticking against the front windows. Then he added, "You alone out there?" "Me and Tuck." He glanced toward my truck. "Old yellow dog?" "Grey now, but yes." "Dogs settle faster than we do. Watch him." I loaded the supplies and sat in the cab a minute before starting up, hands on the wheel, wipers sweeping a metronome across the glass. I told myself this couldn't be real in any framework I trusted, that maybe Earl had humoured me because I looked worn down, that maybe I had walked myself into a pocket of coincidence and grief. But each argument came apart on contact with memory. The even spacing of stones, the dry cedar under rain, the figure stepping around saplings like they mattered. I had no explanation that respected the details. By early afternoon, with the rain easing to mist, I turned back through the gate at the parcel and felt less like I was trespassing in my own life. 3 days passed in a rhythm that would have looked ordinary from the road. I fixed a gutter seam, replaced 2 rotten porch boards, changed oil in the generator, and called the bank to get 1 late fee waived if I paid by Friday. Cody still did not answer when I tried, so I left a short voicemail that did not beg and did not perform. "Hey, bud, it's Dad. I'm at Grandpa's place getting things in shape. No emergency. I love you. I'll call Sunday." Then I put the phone away and went outside before I could replay my tone into regret. Each day I walked the spur with Tuck, and each day some small marker appeared where weather or wash had altered the safe line. 3 stones at a fork where the low root looked tempting but turned slick. Crossed sticks beside a concealed hole near the willow edge. Once, a short run of bark peeled and laid bright side up where dusklight would catch it. Tuck treated each sign like routine guidance, trotting ahead and waiting when I slowed to stare. On the fourth evening, clouds dropped low and thick before supper, and the maze started making that full-throated sound it gets when multiple channels rise together. I needed a toolbox I'd left near the lower cut bank after tightening the old culvert brace, so I grabbed my jacket and headlamp and headed out with Tuck before dark closed in. Mist moved between the trunks in soft sheets, not spooky, just dense enough to flatten distance. 10 yards looked like 20, then 5 again. My own bootsteps sounded muffled on wet leaves. Halfway down the spur, Tuck stopped and angled his body across my shins, a gentle block. He didn't bark. He looked downhill, then back up at me, then downhill again. "You got an opinion," I said. "Show me." He took 2 steps right, off the old line, and stood beside a fresh row of pale stones laid along the upslope edge of the path. Not random this time, not a simple crossing. It was a curve, deliberate and clean, leading away from the familiar dip and toward a narrow shoulder above it. I clicked on my headlamp and followed the arc with the beam. The usual route ahead had slumped where water undermined the bank. Another 10 minutes and I would have walked straight onto mud with nothing under it. The new line skirted the weak ground and pointed toward fir roots that held firm even in rain. I swallowed hard and felt my pulse settle rather than spike. "Okay," I said quietly into the mist. "I see it." We followed the stones upslope, slow because of Tuck's hip, and came to a shallow saddle where the path forked around a cluster of wind-thrown limbs. My light caught movement beyond the fork, broad and dark between 2 trunks. I froze, not out of fear, more out of the sudden need to be precise with my own body. Tuck stood at my knee, tail low but loose, and watched with that same steady attention he used at the porch when he waited for me to finish talking to myself. The figure stepped into clearer view at maybe 25 yards. In the mist and low light, scale still struck like a physical thing. Shoulders wider than a gate panel. Height enough that his head sat near the lower sweep of fir branches that hung well above mine. Dark fur slicked with moisture, not shaggy wild so much as weathered, like bark in rain. He did not square up. He turned slightly sideways, making himself narrower on the trail, and lowered one massive hand to a stone at his feet. What happened next was so practical, my mind almost missed the weight of it. He lifted that stone, something I'd need both hands for, and set it at the left side of the fork. Then he picked up another, larger one, and set it on the right branch, but farther back, creating a clear visual lane toward the middle track that stayed on high ground. He adjusted the second stone with fingertips, nudged it 2 inches until the spacing matched the line below, and stepped back. Not hurried, not dramatic. Workmanlike. Exact. I stood there with rain collecting on my jacket collar, watching a being the size of a small shed, finish route marking like a county hand who took pride in clean edges. A deer came out of the brush uphill then, a yearling doe, close enough that I could hear her hooves click on rock. She paused, looked at the figure, looked at us, and lowered her head to browse wet leaves, as if all of this sat inside normal. That did more to settle me than any argument I could have invented. Tuck gave one soft huff and leaned lightly against my calf. The figure lifted his head and looked directly at me. In the beam spill and mist, I could finally make out his eyes, amber brown and steady. No panic in them, no challenge either. I felt seen in a way that was almost embarrassing, like he had watched me stumble through these weeks and decided I might eventually learn if someone kept laying out the lesson plain. I wanted to say 100 things and knew none of them were necessary, so I kept to the truth I could carry. "Thank you," I said. "For me, for him too." At Tuck's name, I touched the old dog's shoulder. The figure's gaze shifted down briefly, then back to me, and he made the smallest movement of his hand toward the center trail, a quiet confirmation. Then he stepped backward off the path, one pace, then another, careful not to break the cedar saplings at his side. In 3 seconds he was partly hidden. In 5, he was shape and shadow. In 10, 5, he was shape and shadow. In 10, only the mist and wet trunks remained, and the woods filled again with water sound and a distant owl beginning its first call. I did not chase. Earl's rule held, and my own did too. I knelt by the newly placed stones and touched each one in turn, cold and solid and undeniably there. Then took my phone from my pocket and snapped 2 photos with the headlamp beam angled low for texture. Not for internet proof, not for town talk, for memory anchored in something I could hold when daylight and doubt started arguing tomorrow. I saved them in a folder named Cold River Markers and put the phone away. We took the center trail exactly as indicated and found the toolbox 20 minutes later where I'd left it, half under a tarp near the brace post, dry enough to matter. On the walk back, Tuck moved easier than he had coming down, trusting the line and not testing side ground. At the porch, I toweled him off, fed him, and checked his paws by lantern light. No cuts, no new limp, just an old dog tired in a good way. I set the toolbox inside, hung my wet jacket, and sat on the step with the rain easing to a fine drift. In my pocket, 2 cold pebbles pressed against my palm where I had slipped them in without thinking from beside that fork, one from each side of the marker pair. I turned them over in the dark and then placed them on the windowsill above the sink, where morning light would hit them first. Not trophies, not evidence for strangers. A reminder that kindness had found me in a language I had not known I still understood. I stood at the sink a long minute after I set those 2 pebbles on the sill, palms flat on chipped enamel, looking at their wet shine in the lantern glow, as if they might rearrange themselves into an explanation I could take to work on Monday. They stayed what they were, smooth river stones, cold and quiet, and I felt how tired I was clear down in my joints. Tuck had already curled up by the stove, nose tucked under tail, trusting me to finish whatever human worrying still needed doing before bed. I fed the fire 2 more cedar sticks from that careful stack and listened to them catch fast, sweet-smelling and dry in a way that still didn't make ordinary sense. Then I opened a can of stew, heated it, and managed 6 spoonfuls before my throat tightened for no practical reason at all. I set the bowl down and reached for my phone instead. The 2 photos from the fork sat sharp and undeniable on the screen. Pale stones in wet, dark ground, one on each side, laid with intent. I zoomed in until pixels broke apart, then zoomed out again, as if scale could settle me. It didn't. What settled me, strangely, was Tuck's breathing behind me and the little sounds of cabin life, doing what cabin life does. The stove ticking as metal warmed, wind easing against the eaves, a drop from that same old roof seam hitting the bucket by the door with patient regularity. Nothing dramatic, just the plain world still turning while mine shifted under my feet. I opened Cody's contact and stared at his name until the screen dimmed. Then I hit call before I could rehearse it to death. Straight to voicemail, same as always. The tone sounded and I nearly hung up, but I heard my own breath catch and forced myself to stay. "Hey, bud, it's Dad." I swallowed and tried again, softer. "It's Dad. I'm at Grandpa's place. I know I've said this before, but I'm staying sober. I'm working at it every day. I needed you to hear my voice tonight because something happened out here that shook loose a lot of things I've been holding shut." I paused, looked at the stones, kept going. "I'm not calling to make you fix me. I'm calling to say I miss you, and I'm sorry for the years I made every conversation about my mess. If you want to call, I'll answer. If you don't yet, I understand. I love you either way. I ended the message and set the phone down with both hands, because one hand wasn't steady. For a minute, nothing happened. Then everything I had kept packed tight since Leah got sick started to move at once. Not like a burst pipe, more like spring ice breaking on a river you thought was solid. I pulled out the chair by the table and sat hard, elbows on my knees, staring at floorboards Daddy had laid crooked and never corrected. The first sound that came out of me was small, almost a laugh, and then it turned into something rougher. I pressed my fist against my mouth and bent over like I could fold the grief into a shape I knew how to carry. I had cried at the hospital, cried at the funeral, cried in the truck twice where nobody saw. This was different. This was months of clenched jaw and counted days and practical chores finally giving way, because a giant, unknown thing in the woods had marked safe footing for me and my old dog without asking for a thing. I told myself this couldn't be the reason a grown man came apart at his kitchen table. I told myself I was just worn down, low blood sugar, no sleep, weather. But the truth sat plain as those stones on the sill. I had believed the world was mostly indifferent and that survival meant expecting less from it every year. Tonight, that belief cracked. Kindness had reached me where pride couldn't block it, and I did not know how to hold that without shaking. Tuck got up slow, crossed the room, and pressed his chest against my shin. I wrapped one arm around his neck and let my forehead rest against his fur while the worst of it moved through. "I'm sorry, buddy," I said into his coat. "I should have done better by all of us sooner." He answered with a soft grunt and stayed put, old and steady, while I breathed my way back to level. By the time the stove burned down to deep red coals, the rain had stopped and the clock over the sink read 10:17. I washed the untouched stew bowl, dried my face on a dish towel, and stepped out onto the porch because the cabin walls felt too close after all that. The air had gone clean and cold, river cold, with mist hanging low over the yard and moonlight coming through in washed silver bands. Wet boards chilled through my socks. Somewhere down toward the maze, water moved loud and full from the day's rain, channels talking to each other in the dark. I could smell alder bark, wood smoke, and the mineral bite of fresh currant over stone. I sat on the top step and let silence do what silence does when you stop fighting it. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts of Leah came without that immediate flinch. I saw her at this same porch rail years back, hair tied up with a pencil, laughing at me for labeling coffee tins with permanent marker like we were running a hardware store. I heard her voice in one plain sentence. "You don't have to earn every good thing." I had spent 14 months acting like love was over, kindness was over, wonder was for people with easier lives. Out there in the timber, something enormous had chosen gentle over force, again and again, and it had done more for my heart than any lecture I'd sat through in county rehab meetings. A soft shift at the tree line made me lift my head. Not a snap, not a rush. Just the faint sound of wet leaves settling under deliberate weight. Tuck, who had followed me out and lay against my boot, raised his head once and looked toward the far edge of the yard. He did not bark. He stood, tail low and loose, and took 2 steps forward as if greeting a familiar neighbor who preferred distance. At first I saw only depth and shadow between trunks. Then a shape separated itself from the dark. He stood partly behind a fir at maybe 30 yards, tall enough that the lower branches framed his shoulders, broader than any man I had ever known, dark coat silvered where moonlight caught damp fur. He did not advance. He did not hide. He simply stood there in stillness so complete it felt like part of the night had taken form and decided to be seen for a moment. My chest tightened, not with fear, with recognition. It was the same calm presence from the fork, now closer to home, as if he had come only to make sure we reached shelter and settled. I rose slowly from the step so I didn't startle Tuck or myself. My hands stayed open at my sides. We watched each other through thin mist drifting between us, and in that quiet I felt an odd dignity in the distance he kept. He gave space the way decent people do. "Made it back," I said, voice low and rough from crying. "Thanks to you." He tilted his head a fraction, then looked down to Tuck. Tuck's tail gave one steady wag. The big figure's gaze returned to me, amber brown catching a thread of moonlight under the brow ridge, calm and unreadable in the best way. No demand in it, no claim, just awareness, patient and whole. I took one step forward off the porch, then stopped because closing distance felt like breaking an agreement neither of us had spoken. "I won't chase you," I said. "I won't bring people out here. I needed you to know I understood what you did." The words sounded small in all that open dark, but they were true, and true was enough. He lowered one massive hand and set it briefly against the trunk beside him, fingers spread with careful pressure, the same controlled movement I had seen when he placed the stones. Then he drew the hand back, shifted his weight, and took a single, backward step into deeper shadow. He paused there a beat, still visible from chest up through mist and branches, and I had the strange, clear feeling that this was his goodbye for the night. No ceremony, no performance, only a courteous leaving. Another step, and the fir trunk took half of him. Another, and he was outline. Then only dark between trees and the normal sounds returning one by one. River, a late insect near the gutter, the soft drip from cedar tips. The yard remained exactly as it had been, except for me. I stayed on the porch a long while after he was gone, not trying to summon him back, not trying to decode anything. Tuck leaned against my leg, warm and solid, and together we watched mist slide across the fence line where I had spent my first day pretending bolts and staples were the only things in my life needing repair. The two pebbles on the windowsill behind me had picked up moonlight and held it. I turned once to look at them and felt that new, fragile steadiness settle deeper. When the cold finally reached my hands, I went inside, banked the stove, and set my phone on the table without checking for a reply that wasn't there yet. I drank a glass of water, brushed my teeth at the tiny sink, and paused before turning down the lantern. "Good night," I said quietly toward the dark window and the trees beyond it, then felt foolish and grateful at the same time. I slept through till dawn for the first time since spring. No hospital alarms in my dreams, no missed call panic, no old arguments replaying themselves. Just deep, unbroken rest with Tuck snoring at the foot of the bed, and river sound moving steady through the open crack of the window, like a road finally graded true after months of washboard and ruts. When I woke, dawn had just started whitening the window, and Tuck was already up, standing by the door with that stiff, old dog patience that meant he needed out now, not after coffee. I pulled on boots, opened the door, and stopped on the threshold. A single pale river stone sat centered on the top porch step, clean despite the wet boards around it, as if it had been placed after the night mist settled and before first light. Not from my sill, not from the fork where I'd taken two, but another one, smooth as an egg and cool when I picked it up. Tuck sniffed it once, then looked toward the trees and wagged like he was greeting someone already walking away. I held that stone in my palm through morning chores. I fed Tuck, brewed coffee, and set all three stones together on the table, the two from the fork and this new one from my step. Then I opened my phone and looked again at the marker photos. No blur, no trick of shadow. Just deliberate placement in wet ground where the safe trail split from the dangerous one. I plugged the phone into an old laptop in the cabin, copied the images into a folder, then onto a thumb drive I labeled with masking tape. Cold River, private. I printed 2 copies at Miller's later that day and put them in a manila envelope with the date and weather written across the front. I did not post them, did not send them, and did not ask strangers to judge what they had not stood still enough to see. The evidence had done its job for me. It had anchored memory to fact. By Friday morning, with low cloud moving fast and the river dropping an inch, I loaded T-posts, reflective tape, and a post driver into the truck and drove to the lower spur. The maze had chewed new edges into the bank, and mud still looked firm where it was hollow underneath. Same trap as before. I started at the gully mouth and worked upslope, setting my own markers at eye level where a flashlight beam would catch from either direction. I painted 2 cedar stakes blaze orange and drove them at the fork, then tied reflective strips along the center trail exactly where the stone line had led me in rain. Tuck stayed close, sitting each time I paused like he was supervising county work standards. At the dangerous branch, I found 3 pale stones newly aligned along the edge, reinforcing the warning I had already learned. I left them where they were and drove my marker 2 feet beyond, a human sign beside a quieter one. "Nobody gets turned around here if I can help it," I said out loud, breathing hard from the post driver. Wind moved through alder, and far below, water ran over cobble with that steady mineral hiss. No birds for half a minute. Then a chickadee called, and 2 more answered upstream. The woods resumed their ordinary conversation, and I felt no pressure in it, only room. That afternoon I drove into town, paid the bank before close, and got the stamped receipt in my hand. 1 late fee waived as promised. I slid the paper into my glove box and sat there a minute, watching rain bead and roll down the windshield. Debt wasn't gone, but it was named and scheduled now, which was its own relief. I called the number of the buyer's agent I'd spoken with in August and told him not to list the parcel. He was quiet for a beat, then said, "You sure?" I looked out at the ridgeline above town, wet and dark and familiar. "Yeah," I said, "I'm sure." He said he'd close the file and wished me luck. That thread ended clean. Before heading back, I stopped at Miller's for dog food and nails. Earl rang me up and gave me the same measured look as before, not prying, just checking if I was still standing inside my own life. "You look like you slept," he said. I did. He nodded once. "You decide on the land?" "Keeping it. Marked the lower trail today with tape and posts." "Good." He rested his forearms on the counter. "My granddad used stone lines in flood years. Said if you find a path laid for you in bad weather, you honor it by making it easier for the next person." He shrugged, almost embarrassed by saying that much. He never explained where he learned it. Maybe he never knew. I let that sit between us a second, then said, "I won't be bringing crowds out there." "I didn't figure you would," he said, and pushed the change toward me. "Some truths don't need a committee." Sunday came clear and cold, the first hard blue sky in days. By late afternoon, I was replacing warped siding on the cabin's north wall, when my phone buzzed on the porch rail with Cody's name. My hands went clumsy all at once. I wiped them on my jeans and answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said. "Hey, bud." A pause, not hostile, just careful. "I got your voicemail. I didn't know what to say." "You don't owe me fast answers." "I know." Another pause. "You sound different." I sat on the porch step, looking at Tuck asleep in a patch of sun. I am different than I was last year. Not fixed, just doing the work for real. He exhaled, and I could hear traffic where he was. "I'm still mad about a lot." You get to be. I don't want speeches, Dad. Then no speeches. We can do 10 minutes on Sundays. You set the time. If you miss one, I'll call next week anyway, and keep it simple. He was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, 7 in the evening, Sundays, 10 minutes. 7 works, and if you show up drunk, I'm done. I won't. All right, he said, voice softer. Give Tuck a scratch for me. I will. When the line clicked off, I stayed there, holding the phone with my thumb over the dark screen, listening to my own breathing. Not a reunion montage, not forgiveness wrapped with a bow. A schedule, a boundary, a start. By the second week of October, the porch had new boards. The gutter held through 2 storms, and I had a lockable cabinet inside for tools and paperwork instead of damp piles on the table. I moved the 3 kept stones into an old tobacco tin lined with a folded shop rag and wrote the dates on a card under them, fork markers, and porch stone. The manila envelope with printed photos went into the same cabinet with tax receipts and the stamped bank payment, all of it accounted for like any other important record. On the shelf above, I set 1 loose cedar stick from that first mysterious stack and left it there, untouched. Not evidence exactly. A thank you I could see. That Wednesday, after my grader shift, I drove out at dusk and walked the marked route with a headlamp to test every reflector. Tuck moved slowly but steady, hip stiff in the cold, and every tape strip flashed right where it should. Near the old fork, I found a short line of river stones, ending at the tree line rather than crossing it, 5 in a gentle arc that stopped where fir shadow began. I stood there with my hand on Tuck's collar and looked into the dim trunks. For a moment, I caught a tall, dark silhouette between 2 trees, still as a post and twice as broad, watching without crowding. I raised my hand once. The shape remained, then stepped back, and was gone. No chase, no signal for more, just that same courtesy offered and returned. I finished the loop, checked the last marker by the gully, and headed home under a rising moon. Back at the cabin, I fed Tuck, called Cody at 7 sharp, and listened while he told me about a brake job he'd botched and fixed, and what his boss said when he stayed late to make it right. I laughed in the right places, asked 1 question at a time, and when 10 minutes hit, I let him be the one to end the call. Afterward, I stood at the sink, looking out at the dark yard, and felt grief still present, but no longer running the whole house. I never did get a tidy explanation for the stillness before each marker, for the way rain never seemed to erase those lines until I no longer needed them, for how a deer could browse 10 yards from a creature that large like gentleness, had its own scent, and everything in the woods recognized it. Earl never added to his granddad's story, and I never pushed him. Some things remained unsolved on purpose. What changed was the framework I carried into each day. I went back to roadwork, paid what I owed, rebuilt the cabin in practical phases, and kept Sunday calls with my son until 10 minutes turned to 20 without either of us announcing it. When I hiked at dusk now, I watched for washouts, checked my markers, and sometimes found new stone lines that guided around fresh trouble and stopped where the timber thickened. I always paused there, hand raised once in thanks, and then went on with the work in front of me. I still missed Leah. I still had hard mornings, but the world no longer felt like a closed ledger of losses. It felt larger, watchful in a kind way, and I carried that home every night like a lamp I didn't have to earn.